Decimus Junius Silanus, Consul 62 BCE. To fully appreciate the significance of the extraordinary careers of great Romans such as Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar, we must first understand their more typical or average colleagues. Silanus, who seems to have lacked any extraordinary talent and whose career was rather quiet, is exactly the sort of person whose experience is a perfect illustration of the norm. Renowned neither as an orator nor as a soldier, and also lacking the imposing pedigree of some of his peers, Silanus was nonetheless able to acquire Rome's highest elected office during a very competitive decade full of dominant and capable contenders for the consulship. Today, Silanus is far less renowned than even his wife, Servilia, who was Caesar's mistress and Brutus's mother. In this video, I will seek to demonstrate that Silanus was a masterful politician with a talent for avoiding controversy with his peers and making strategically advantageous marriage alliances, which set his family up in the long run. We don't know a great deal about Decimus Junius Silanus's family tree. From what we can gather, it would appear that his father is none other than Marcus Junius Silanus, the consul of 109 BCE. Marcus had been the first member of his plebeian branch of the Junii to achieve the consulship. His had been a very controversial run as consul, as he had presided over the massive defeat at the hands of the Cimbri. This, of course, initiated a crisis which led to the appointment of Marius, who then created professional standing legions in order to deal with the problem. For his part in allowing his army to be smashed by the Cimbri, Marcus found himself prosecuted several years later, but he was able to successfully defend himself against the charges of Saturninus and Glaucia. I've made videos on those two individuals in the past, so if you're interested in them, look them up on my playlist. Despite his family's relatively modest standing in Rome, Decimus still seems to have had more political clout than most of the major players in Rome during his prime political years, despite any obvious reason for that being the case. It's possible the family had a great deal of money. We don't know for sure whether they did or not, but I will argue that a lot of this is due to Decimus's own political skills, and we'll see some evidence of that as we go along. We don't know all of the details of Silanus's career, and this is most likely because he was not the flashiest guy in the world, and he was pretty successful at avoiding controversy. We do know, however, that he held the aedileship in 70, and this is significant for a number of reasons. Normally, the holding of the aedileship is not all that well recorded, so this implies that he must have done a noteworthy job. And the significance of the aedileship is that it allows someone to really court popularity with the people by putting on great games that people will remember for years to come. So this might be how he built up a lot of his popularity with people in order to build up his electability later on. Not everyone served as aedile, but people who did serve in that capacity had a better chance ultimately of becoming consul. Another thing that leads me to believe that he came from a family with more money than average is that the aedileship is a particularly expensive office. You pretty much have to pay for all of this stuff out of pocket, or at least a lot of it. So if Silanus came from a rather wealthy family compared to other senators, this would give him a leg up as aedile, and would also explain how he was able to compete with people who had, frankly, more actual achievements under their belt. He entered the consular race for 63, and at this point we can finally determine his age. If he was eligible in 63, as a plebeian, it means that he was at least 43 years of age, so he would have been born no earlier than 106. Silanus was competing with a crowded and rather difficult field of opponents. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the great orator, was there. Gaius Antonius Hybrida, whose father or grandfather had been the famous orator Antonius from the 90s, and Lucius Sergius Catilina, better known to us as Catiline, a charismatic populist who had run for consul before, and come very close. Along with Catiline, Silanus was defeated, and since Catiline ran such a high-profile campaign, and since many senators flocked to Cicero and Antonius in order to defeat Catiline, it's very likely that Silanus ended up placing last in this race. So most likely he felt on some level that he was somewhat of a victim of a rigged election which was designed not to stop him, but stop someone else. And because of that, just like Catiline, who also felt cheated, Silanus was determined to run yet again in the consular election of 62. Consuls of any given year were elected a full 6 months prior to when they actually assumed office, meaning that the election of 62 actually took place, or should have taken place, in July of 63. However, this was not quite the case for the 62 election, because the reigning consul Cicero had deep suspicions of Catiline, his former opponent, and was trying to use the Senate to get Catiline banned from the 62 election. However, he couldn't produce enough evidence at that time to convince the Senate to kick Catiline out of the election, and therefore the election was only delayed 1 month before it was finally held in August. The field was once again crowded, and the fighting was fierce. The field included Lucius Licinius Murena, Servius Sulpicius Rufus, and then the returning Catiline and Silanus. Desperate to defeat Catiline, Cicero and his allies, who were by this point the Optimates — Cicero switched sides a couple times during his political career — decided to award Lucullus a delayed triumph so that his veterans would come to town to celebrate, and they knew that these men could be counted upon to vote for Murena, who was a former legate of Lucullus. There also were some unusual and almost certainly illegal acts made on Murena's behalf to make sure that he beat out Catiline. So Murena was heavily assisted effectively by the bulk of the Senate and won one of the consulships. The other person who won, apparently without any controversy, and possibly even in first place, was Silanus. So that is how he came to office. Surprisingly boring win in what can only be described as an openly rigged election. The historian Sallust provides a rather tendentious account of the Senate meeting where Cicero asked for the opinions of his colleagues on the issue of what was to be done with the co-conspirators of Catiline. The account tends to focus very heavily on the contributions of Caesar and Cato, who he calls the emerging great men of the time, but in reality the major players, as I've argued in the past, were clearly the more senior men who had more influence going into the debate. Cicero decided to ask Silanus to be the first speaker on the issue. For his part, Cicero wanted to put these men to death, but he wanted to get the permission and approval of his colleagues before doing so. While he did have authority under the ultimate decree of the Senate to act in any way he saw fit, he knew that there would be massive political blowback if he was to put men to death on this authority without the approval of his colleagues. Even with the approval, if you know anything about Cicero's career, there was still blowback because there was not a full trial. So Cicero is playing this safe, and it would appear that the consul-elect Silanus also chose to play it as safe as possible. In his speech, which apparently was eloquent but somewhat empty, Silanus called for the ultimate punishment to be meted out to the conspirators. Presumably this means death, since it's hard to think of anything more ultimate than something which ends the life of the person in question. Then, later on, when it got to the reigning praetor Caesar, he was able to really shift the momentum of the debate by arguing in favor of imprisonment around Italy. Silanus felt the wind blowing, and he felt the ground shifting, so he spoke up to clarify that when he said ultimate punishment, what he meant was imprisonment, because obviously ultimate punishment is the best and clearest euphemism one can use for imprisonment. He was lying. Clearly, he was just trying to go along with the crowd, avoid controversy. This is Silanus at his most slippery. And I think that this is probably fairly typical of a Silanus performance. This is a guy who was a people pleaser, not a guy who took controversial stands. Unlike his brother-in-law, Cato the Younger, who I believe was a praetor-elect at this time, stood up and gave a fiery speech in favor of death. And he called all of the men who had been in favor of imprisonment either disloyal or stupid or weak, and then the whole Senate got fired up. Caesar was threatened with violence at one point. Cicero had to basically embrace him and escort him out. And while Caesar clearly was the guy who ate the most shit during this exchange, I would argue that Silanus also got embarrassed. His own brother-in-law effectively called him a pussy in front of the rest of the Senate for the position that he had taken. So that's not a good look. And it also shows, I think, in many ways why someone like Cato, despite having so much influence and having some charisma and principles, was not a very successful politician. He had very little, if any, tact whatsoever. Where someone like Silanus, even if he lacked a little bit in testicular fortitude, did have some degree of subtlety and went to some lengths to make sure that he did not alienate other people. All things considered, the year 62 was a fairly quiet year in the history of the late Republic. It was a year more of anticipation and mopping up than of action. Silanus and Murena, as consuls, presided over a Rome which was very much wondering what it would be like when Pompey returned from the east with all of his newfound wealth and prestige. Would the Senate still function the way it was supposed to, or would Pompey have so much prestige that he would effectively just run the state almost like an unofficial dictator? The other issue that people were dealing with, especially the ex-consul Cicero, was trying to hunt down all of the people who still had some ties to Catiline and needed to be dealt with. Nonetheless, despite the fact that they themselves were largely sidelined by these two major concerns which went beyond their scope of authority as consuls, Silanus and Murena worked well together and were able to pass a fairly significant law. The Lex Junia Licinia built on a law from 98, which effectively did two things. One, it banned irrelevant writers to bills, meaning passages mandating things unrelated to the main text and main thrust of the bill. And it also mandated a minimum 3-week gap between a law's proposal and then its presentation to an assembly for ratification. So basically what this did is slow down the legal process a bit in order to avoid people voting on things they didn't understand. And while this is a relatively minor bill in the sense that it's more housekeeping than revolutionary, it's still something which was in the interest of good government. And there's nothing wrong with having a rather quiet consulship, and having this one achievement is still better than what a whole lot of consuls had to their name, which in many cases was effectively nothing. Despite the fact that he was an accomplished consul, Silanus was not necessarily the most accomplished person in his family. He married Servilia after the death of her first husband Brutus, and the couple went on to have 4 children. Servilia today is mostly famous as Caesar's mistress and Cato's sister, since Silanus has been forgotten. It must be the case that Servilia was already with Caesar when Silanus was still alive and the two were married, as during the Catilinarian proceedings, Cato saw that Caesar received a message from someone and he thought it was suspicious, so he demanded that the message be read aloud. Caesar then handed him the message, and it was a love letter from Servilia. Cato was furious, he balled it up and threw it away. It's interesting to note that this was at a time when Silanus was the consul-elect. So while the story is usually told in a way which makes it seem like Caesar made a fool of Cato, in many ways what he was doing was publicly cucking Silanus. That being said, it's not quite the same as it would be in today's world, since while affairs were looked down upon in many ways, it was kind of understood that people didn't necessarily marry for love, and many of the men in the Senate had mistresses or had wives who had other lovers, so this was not exactly unusual. Their first daughter, Junia Prima, is relatively obscure. She might have died young or married someone who went on to obscurity. However, their other three children had some pretty important marriages and or careers. The second daughter, Junia Secunda, ended up marrying Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, one of the members of the Second Triumvirate. The third daughter, Junia Tertia, also sometimes referred to as Tertulla, married Gaius Cassius Longinus, one of the major assassins of Julius Caesar in 44. As for Silanus' son Marcus, named for his grandfather, he served first under Caesar, then under Lepidus, and then under Antony, before finally joining up with Augustus right before the Battle of Actium and serving as his consular colleague in 25 BCE. Marcus then had children who were very well connected and were taken care of by the early Julio-Claudian dynasty. So while Decimus Silanus had no great outstanding achievements, he did really pave the path for his family to go on to achieve great things, and he made sure that his relatively new family got its blood into the bloodlines of many more well-established families. And again, one of the reasons why that could have been the case, I believe, is because Silanus had a good deal of money. Although that is hard to prove, we don't exactly have too many detailed financial records of the estate holdings of Roman senators. After he left the consulship, Decimus Junius Silanus faded into obscurity and died at some unknown point in history. Personally, he had a relatively minimal impact on the politics of his time when compared to other consuls who seem to have had much bigger personalities and much more strident opinions. That being said, Silanus clearly knew what he was doing as he set his family up for generations of prosperity and survival. He chose very well when it came to son-in-laws, obviously, as we saw. He chose two of the men who went on to be major players within just a couple of decades. The political prominence of his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in the early imperial period suggests that he absolutely was one of the most skillful masters of the politics of marriage alliance. However, he's sort of the outlier among the 63 and 62 consuls, insofar as he's not really a contentious guy and he's not controversial. And when I say not contentious, I mean not only was he never accused of trying to rig an election, but he also was never accused of trying to murder anyone, even though he had some motive, at least, against both his brother-in-law Cato and Caesar, who was his wife's lover. While it's not entirely clear, based on his son's conduct later, it is highly likely that despite his marriage relationship with Cato, Silanus was actually a political ally of Caesar, who, as we established, was sleeping with his wife and doing so in a way which was rather public. Silanus, in other words, is the kind of guy who was thinking in the long run and clearly was not an emotional decision maker. Maybe it doesn't make for the most inspiring story, but it does show you that for everyone like a Julius Caesar, or everyone like a Cato, or even someone with the confidence, undeserved confidence of someone of, say, Metellus Scipio, there are the people out there like Decimus Junius Silanus who go along to get along, and in the end do just as well or better than their more charismatic and assertive colleagues. I'm Thersites the Historian. Next time we'll talk about Silanus's more interesting and assertive colleague, Murena.